Hello everyone, and if you clicked on this video, you're probably wondering, well, how do I play chess? And how do I learn it fast? Well, it's a good thing you clicked on this video because today I'm going to be teaching you exactly how to play the game of chess. So right here we have a chessboard, 64 squares, both white and black. The first main rule that every beginner needs to know is that white always moves first. If you've seen people play, then you'll always see that when the game starts out, that white opens the pieces first, and then black responds, and it keeps going back and forth, like kind of like checkers, until basically one of the colors wins. But before I get into more like advanced topics, I'm basically going to teach you how to move every single piece and how to objectively win the game. See, with chess, it's very, very simple, but also very complex once you dive more into basically the whole chess lore. So let's get right into it. Our first lesson here is a pawn lesson. So basically, these two things right here are pawns. Now, pawns can move 1 to 2 spaces, as we can see here, right? They can move 1 or 2 spaces here. Now, this is only depending on whether it's the first time you move the pawn. So, let's say I wanted to move this pawn, right? I can move it 2 squares, right? But after that, I can no longer move it 2 moves. I can only move it once. So, yeah, that's a specific rule that chess pawns do. Also, if you do not move it twice in the first move, you won't be able to move it like second time. So that's just something that you should probably know. It's a little bit tricky, but it'll be easy once you remember that. And pawns, as we can see here, move only in a straight line, like this. So basically, pawns are kind of like the simplest piece out there because they move 1 square per time in the same direction. However, if we have a circumstance where a pawn is like this and a pawn is like this, you see they're kind of like diagonal to each other. Well, in this position, since it's white to move, white actually has the ability to capture this piece. And the reason is because pawns can capture diagonally. But they can only capture diagonally left or right. They can't capture backwards. That's not a thing. They can't capture to the back or to the sides or even the front. Although the front would make the most sense, but yeah. And yeah, this is not checkers, so pieces cannot hop over to capture. So yeah, so this is how I would capture the piece. Now, do you always have to capture the piece? No, you can simply just push up, and yeah, black would not be able to capture you in any way because the only way black could capture you is on either these 2 squares. So it really depends on the position. So let's continue on uh, with a more, I guess, advanced lesson on the pawns because you do not have just one pawns, but it's a set of 8 pawns. And this is kind of a lot to deal with, but in reality, it's very easy. So pawns are basically your, like, I guess, fortress for the rest of the pieces that are like in this area. So of course, white always starts out. Now I'm just gonna move this pawn here. Uh, a good idea would be probably to position your pawns to where they cannot be captured. So whatever you do, don't put your pawns in these 2 squares because then they're going to be captured very easily. For example, if you were to put your pawn here, it could be easily captured and then you're just down on material. So what you might want to do instead is you probably want to block that pawn so it can no longer move forward. After that, which white will probably respond with pushing their pawn probably here to protect this pawn from being taken. It's a really interesting thing to see all the pawns work together, but it's very simple. So I'm just going to play a quick pawn and pawn game. So let's say we have here. We're going to want to move here to protect this pawn. Black will probably do something similar, except they want to take control of this square right here, later pushing on this in the future. So white will respond with something similar, like this. Black will later push this. White has to take, well, they don't have to take, but they decide to take. Black will take back, and now black remains in control of these squares. Now, in order to kick out black, white decides to push here. However, taking would not be a great idea for black, because then it just restricts the movement of this pawn right here. So instead, black decides to push forward. Now, this is getting pretty dangerous for white, because white now can either decide to take the black pawn or push forward. However, this would be bad in both circumstances, because if white decides to take, black takes back, and there's absolutely no way for the pawns to take this black pawn. This black pawn is free to move to the end of the board, where it will then promote to a queen. Now, you're probably wondering, what the heck is promotion? Well, let me show you in a simple demonstration. Now, even though we see black has a free path to promotion, white can also freely promote as well, since there are no pawns protecting the files that the pawn is going to. So here we basically have a pawn race. And now, once you reach the end of the board, you have a decision to make. Basically, the end of the board for pawns is kind of like a reward. And for that reward, you can choose to basically, I guess, level it up into a different type of piece, whether it be a rook, bishop, knight, or queen. The most common type of piece that people tend to promote the pawn to is the queen, mainly because the queen is very powerful, as the queen can move in nearly any direction it wants. White will probably promote to queen as well. So now we know the basic rules of pawns, but before I start diving into queens and all the more advanced pieces, let's take it easy with the kings. So the kings are very simple chess pieces. You see, the kings are probably the most simplest piece out there, but I didn't start with them for a reason, because I wanted to start with the pawns to show you how to begin the game, or else you wouldn't be able to know how to play. So the kings remain on these squares for most of the game unless you decide to move them. Now, the kings move in a simple way. You see, my white king here can move one square in any direction that it wants. Absolutely any direction. The same thing goes for the black king. It can move one square in any direction it chooses. From there, that's it. Black can also move in any square it wants. And now you see white has a one square radius around it, basically, of where it can move, whether it be these squares, or these squares. So it's very simple. We see here that the king can only move one square per turn in any direction, whether it be forward, backward, or diagonally. How useful is this really? Well, I mean, it is useful in most circumstances, considering that you might need to escape an attack, or just moving your king in general. However, this kind of makes the king extremely weak, as the king doesn't really have a lot of moving ability. So your king is basically immobile. Now, another important rule of the both kings that I need to tell you about is that in chess, the kings have such a strong hatred for each other, such a strong rivalry, that they refuse to be next to each other. For example, this white king cannot be on these squares. Probably wondering, well, why? Can't you just move to those squares? Well, basically, in chess, it is illegal, or it's not allowed to capture the kings. The kings remain on the board at all costs. They cannot be removed from the board. They are the only piece that stays there at the end of the game. Therefore, the kings are basically immortal. I'm not sure how that works, but yeah. So, anyways, kings cannot be taken or eaten. So, if I were to violate this rule by moving my king here, the black king would have the ability to eat my king, and that's just not allowed. So, therefore, the kings are not allowed to be completely next to each other. They can be one square away from each other like they are right now, but if I were to move my king, as we can see here, the only options I have now are these. I cannot move in these two squares, and neither can black. Black can neither move in any of these squares, as we see here. Why? Because, well, they hate each other. Another famous thing that I've heard of is that the kings can't stand each other because they have bad breath, so that's why they don't stand too close to each other. So that's a little funny tidbit, but yeah, that's basically how the kings move. Moving on, we have the bishops. The bishops are a little bit more advanced. They're kind of similar to pawns in the way that they move, or I guess capture in any sense, because these bishops move diagonally anywhere. Bishops are cool because they can literally go from one point of the board, like if there was a bishop here, it could go all the way over here in one move. Uh, and that's amazing. But aside from that, bishops are kind of straightforward. You have two bishops on each side, a dark squared bishop, which is what we call this one right here, because the bishop will only be on the dark colored squares, meaning that never in the game will it be able to get on these light squares. The reason? Because the bishop only moves diagonally, so there is absolutely no way for the bishop to change to the white squares. And you have your light squared bishop, where, in contrast to the dark squared bishop, can only move in the light squares. So yeah, it's very interesting that you have basically two almost different bishops, one that can move in the dark squares and the other that can move in the light squares. But it just makes it like interesting for you to think, well, which bishop am I going to use for which circumstance? And for the way that bishops capture each other is diagonal. Simple. Like the way they move, they also capture the same way. So if there is a piece in their way, like this bishop for example, this can be captured by the black bishop, as shown below. So there you have it. Bishops are fairly simple and straightforward, so there's nothing much to them. Now for the rooks. The rooks are probably my favorite piece in chess, mostly because uh, I'm a big fan of like the way that rooks move, and they are really strong, especially when you have two of them, like we have here. Now, this position you'll probably be able to reach, but not really. This isn't a good example of how rooks are like, but basically, a rook can move in a straight line anywhere, forward, backwards, left, or right. Here it can only move forwards or right because it is on the left bottom corner. However, if we move this to the middle somewhere, like here, now we see that its mobility has increased to nearly every side of the board. No, actually every side of the board, as we see here. So yeah, rooks are very powerful, especially when they are together. Now, how do rooks capture each other? Well, similar to the bishops, rooks capture each other if they are on their direct path of movement, as we see with this black rook. This black rook can capture the white rook because it is in its sight, I guess. And so black can capture the white rook very easily, and vice versa. If it was white's turn to move, white could capture the black bishop as well. So very interesting stuff. Then we have the knight. The knights move in a very strange way. Knights move in otherwise known as an L shape. It's very hard to explain, but trust me, once you understand it, you'll get it down very easy. So let's take this knight for example. This knight can move in this direction, or this direction. So we see it looks a little bit weird, but trust me, I'll explain it a little bit easier. So our knight is on this square, right? So it can move basically one square forward and two squares to, I guess, the right, if that's where it's facing. And we see how it makes kind of a letter L. Well, basically, if it can make that letter L, it can move to that square. So basically, that's how this can go here. Now, another example of this is going here. It's four squares, but it's one jump here and two to the right. And we can see that the white knight will end up here. And if you tilt your head a little bit, you can kind of see that it makes a sideways L. Same thing with here. If you can see that L shape, then you can move it there. Another interesting thing to note about knights is that knights are the only piece in chess that can jump over pieces. So originally, in a regular chessboard, you would have the front row of pawns here, right? Knights are the only pieces that can jump over that wall. See, because the pawns would otherwise obstruct its movement. The rooks would not be able to move forward, neither would the bishops, nor the queen or the king. So the knight has that special ability. So knights are fairly interesting. But how does one capture a knight? It's very simple. If your knight is basically in the path or direction of another knight, then you can capture it. So knights also capture in an L shape, as we see here. Knights also have a lot of degrees of movement, even though we don't typically notice it, because it's a little bit hard, but in any sense, this is basically how the knight moves. If you have any more questions, feel free to send me a comment on how the knights move, because I really want to get that explanation through to you guys. Because the knight, although it's not the hardest piece in chess, it might be kind of strange to learn it at first. Now for the queens. The queens, you only get one queen per side in each of the games, and this is mainly because the queens are the most strongest piece in chess. Ooh-wee, they are strong. Now, this is why. As we can see here, because I already clicked the white queen, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees of movement. And that's because it's on the edge of the board. But let's say I were to move it here, here. Now we click it, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 areas of movement. That means that the white queen can go to any one of these squares that I'm highlighting right now. That's powerful. So how exactly do queens capture? Well, as you might expect, queens also capture in the area that they go through, like the direction. So, like this black queen here, it could be easily captured by the white queen since it is in its line of sight. And there you have it. Basic queen stuff. The queen cannot jump over pieces like the knight, and if you notice, the queen is basically like a combined rook and a bishop because it has all these degrees of movement. It moves forward, backwards, left and right like a rook, but it can also move diagonally like a bishop. I forgot to mention one thing, that bishops also can move diagonally backwards, but I didn't really show that as well. Now, this is basically how a simple chessboard looks. You've got all the pieces and everything here. Of course, white starts out and then black responds. So, now that you've learned how all the pieces move, how exactly do you win the game? Let me show you an example from one of the games that I actually played here. I am playing as black, and white opens with the white pawn. I respond with the black pawn right here, and then white continues to take control over the center. In chess, it is a good idea to keep control of the center because that is where most of the action happens. Aside from that, I went knight to f6. Now, the reason why I said knight to f6 is because in chess, if you notice here, right on the edges of these squares, you can see little letters and numbers here on the sides. Well, if I rotate the board, and if you're in white's perspective, it goes from A to H and 1 to 8. This is the numbering and letter system that chess uses to basically create notations. You don't really need to know about notations if you don't plan on playing in tournaments or anything like that, but it is useful to know what they are for. And we basically use them to describe the coordinates that the pieces are going to, just to make it, I guess, easier. If it doesn't sound that easy, I mean, I don't know. I wasn't the one who came up with this, but still, it's pretty good to know. Anyways, white continues developing the knight. We have pawn to g6, pawn h3, and I put my bishop on g7. Now, as we can see, white looks better overall because they have more control of the center, like I said previously, but it's still an even game. White moves the bishop, and this is a very special move called castle, which I will get into the next video of more advanced moves in chess. Aside from this, we have the move pawn to e5, offering an exchange of the pawns. I take, he takes back. I go knight here, offering an exchange of the knights. He does not take and instead develops his queen, so I take, he takes back with the queen. I then do the move, oh, that was good. Some lag there. I made knight to c6, attacking both the pawn with this knight and this bishop. He decides to castle. I take. He moves his queen to safety. I threaten the queen with the white bishop. He moves back to safety. And I offer an exchange of queens. He decides to take it, and the king moves over one square as we've seen before to protect this pawn. I continue. I move back to bring my bishop back to safety. He goes knight to f3. I decide to go back, bringing my piece to safety. He brings out his knight to attack my bishop here on e6. I continue to develop my pawns. He develops a bishop, I develop my rook. He develops another pawn, I develop another pawn. And now this bishop is threatening to take my knight. So I move it here to attack bishop. He moves to safety. I continue to move, although that was a blunder on my part because I did not see that this was unprotected. He takes. I push my pawn to protect my knight, which was already protected, but to add further protection, and also to prevent white's bishop from taking that pawn. He takes my bishop with the knight. I take back. He moves his pawn, potentially freeing up any case of back rank mate, which I will talk about in another video. I take the pawn that was hanging, and I fall into an unfortunate trap, which is called a fork. A fork is a tactic which is kind of an advanced thing in chess, but basically what happens is when a piece targets two pieces at the exact same time, and you cannot save both without losing one. Unless, of course, there's certain circumstance. But in this case, I could not save it. So yes, I did play very poorly here. That was on my part, but either way, I decided to take that bishop that was hanging to make it at least equal. Then I offered an exchange of pawns, an exchange of rooks. I attack the bishop. He moves it to safety. I move my pawn because it is targeted by the rook. He moves his pawn. I move my king out. And I start walking my king. The rook is there to prevent the pawn from going any further from promoting, as we saw earlier. After an exchange and a movement of knights, we come to this position. I am doing very bad overall because, as we can see, white has a rook and is way more active at targeting these two pieces. I just have a black knight and a couple of pawns. This is winning for white, but I still manage to at least make it a little bit. I give a check with the pawn, and the king goes over to prevent the pawn from promoting, again as we saw earlier. White takes that pawn that was there. I take that pawn that was hanging, and white decides to take that pawn that was also hanging. I decide to move my king over, and eventually I plan on promoting this pawn to a queen. So white goes behind the pawn to prevent it from being taken. I move, and now white is already starting to promote. This looks over for me, as we now see that white has a queen, a rook, and a pawn, whereas I have only 2 pawns and a knight. However, in chess, there is a specific way to win, and this is called checkmate. You see, checkmate is basically not where you capture the king, but where you put it in a position of where it cannot escape from being captured. For example, this is checkmate. You might be wondering why. How is the game over? I kind of decided to use an advanced checkmate that not a lot of beginners see. It's not very common, but it is an interesting one. But this is just to explain how you win the game. So checkmate is basically where you put the opponent in check, and the opponent's king can not move out of check. Basically, it's stuck. So, what is check exactly? Well, earlier on, we saw here that I gave the white king a check. Now, what exactly is a check? Well, a check is basically where one of your pieces is threatening to capture the king. As we see here, I pushed my pawn forward, right? Now, since pawns can capture diagonally, I am threatening to capture this white king here. So, since kings cannot be captured, as I explained earlier, the king has to move away. And so that is why the king moved here. The king could not capture my pawn because it was protected by my knight. So how is this checkmate? Well, you see, the knight is threatening to capture the king. And if the king were to move to either one of these squares, it would also be captured because of the pawn. And, like I explained earlier, white's king cannot get within one square of the black king. So it cannot go here, because then it would be one square away from the king. And it cannot go here, because it would be one square away from the black king. And it would also threaten of being captured. And this means that the game is over. So this is very interesting because it's not like you captured the opponent's king, but you would capture it if they moved anything else. So that means there's nothing the king can do. And that's basically how to play chess. Now, I know there was a lot of advanced terms that I didn't go over, but this is basically just a beginner's tutorial on how to start playing chess. If you want to learn more about how to actually play chess and get good to the point where you can even beat your grandfather at chess, then continue watching my videos because I upload one video a month uh, doing chess lessons like these, explaining how to actually win, and I give very easy tips and tutorials. And also, I tend to provide exceptional chess entertainment for those of you who are already good at chess or just want to see some interesting chess content. So again, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the Comeback Kid. Thank you so much.